On one side, a music icon reigning over an untouchable empire of wealth and absolute power. On the other side, a man caught in a public freefall, entangled in an endlessly complicated domestic life. When Mariah Carey married Nick Cannon, she broke Hollywood's unspoken rules of power dynamics. But when the glamorous facade shattered, the outcome wasn't a public shouting match. It was a cold, clinical legal war. So what is the real truth about their messy divorce? The core figures driving this unprecedented collapse occupy entirely different stratospheres within the industrial machine of global entertainment. Mariah Angela Carey was born in the United States on March 27, 1969. She stands as a global music icon and an undisputed powerhouse within the entertainment sector, commanding a net worth in the hundreds of millions of dollars. She is the ultimate paradigm of a powerful, wildly successful woman who is ruthlessly strict regarding the protection of her public image. Nicholas Scott Cannon was born in the United States on October 8, 1980. He carved out a lucrative career as a television host, actor, and comedian. While he possesses recognizable fame and his own wealth, his status shrinks to microscopic proportions when placed adjacent to Carey. In the unforgiving hierarchy of Hollywood, public opinion and industry insiders perpetually evaluate him as the subordinate player, completely outmatched in both global prestige and financial leverage. The critical era defining this power struggle spans from the initial legal filings in 2014 through the finalization in 2016, extending into the present day with a relentless chain of personal scandals. The foundation of this marriage rested heavily on the lingering trauma of absolute subjugation, far removed from any spontaneous burst of romance. Long before Cannon entered her orbit, Carey endured a suffocating, highly controlled first marriage to the former chairman of Sony Music. That relationship was characterized by a staggering power imbalance. The environment Carey navigated during the 1990s was heavily monitored. She resided in a sprawling compound in New York that functioned as a high-security gilded cage. Every movement was surveilled. Her professional decisions, her wardrobe, her public appearances, and her personal interactions were strictly vetted and restricted by an executive who viewed her not just as a wife, but as his most valuable corporate asset. The psychological toll of this early environment fundamentally rewired how she would approach every subsequent relationship. When she executed her escape from that marriage and severed her professional ties with the record label, she demanded absolute sovereignty. She spent the following decade painstakingly building an independent global empire, establishing herself as an untouchable entity. However, this extreme level of wealth and power inherently breeds profound isolation. The air at the top of the entertainment industry is exceptionally thin, and the individuals occupying that space are perpetual targets for financial extraction and exploitation. Carey required a safe harbor. She wanted the traditional markers of a family and the emotional stability that comes with a dedicated partner. Yet the survival instincts forged during her years of being controlled dictated a non-negotiable condition. She could never again be the subordinate party. She required a partner who could provide emotional support without posing the slightest threat to her autonomy, her finances, or her decision-making authority. She needed a partner entirely content existing within the massive infrastructure she had already built. In early 2008, Cannon fit the profile. He offered youthful energy and public devotion, serving as a highly visible, eager counterweight to the heavily guarded atmosphere of her daily life. He was deeply entrenched in modern pop culture and possessed a natural affability, making him an excellent public accessory. He demonstrated a complete willingness to orbit her son, to carry her train on the red carpet, and to publicly worship the ground she walked on. The courtship bypassed the prolonged vetting process typical of high net worth individuals. Within mere weeks of their initial romantic domestic involvement. They executed a secretive wedding ceremony in the Bahamas. The suddenness of the union sent shockwaves through the financial and entertainment sectors. Industry analysts scrutinized the gaping chasm in their respective socioeconomic statuses. It was a strategic acquisition disguised as a whirlwind romance. Carey had successfully acquired a partner who provided the optics of a perfect family unit while posing absolutely zero threat to her institutional power. In the immediate aftermath, a highly calculated symbiotic balance was achieved. The marriage provided profound benefits for both parties utilizing entirely different currencies. For Carey, the union provided an instant injection of cultural relevance and a stabilizing domestic presence. Cannon served as a human shield against the isolating pressures of her immense fame. He was the enthusiastic, supportive husband who applauded from the front row while she continued to dominate the global charts and secure massive residency contracts. He provided the framework of a traditional family unit, eventually fathering their twins and fulfilling her stated desire for motherhood within a highly secure and controlled environment. Her legacy brought the prestige, and his presence brought a contemporary, accessible energy to her carefully guarded public persona. For Cannon, the marriage offered an instant catapult into the global elite, granting him unrestricted access to a lifestyle his own capital could never sustain. However, the architecture of their relationship rested on a strict power imbalance. His continued access was entirely dependent on his compliance within an empire he neither built nor owned. Regardless of the public displays of affection, the matching outfits on ski slopes, or the curated family photographs, the undeniable reality remained that Cannon was a guest in a kingdom he did not build and did not own. Every piece of luxury, every layer of private security, and every major domestic decision ultimately flowed from her capital. The infrastructure of their lives was entirely reliant on her continuous output, her vocal cords, and her intellectual property. Living in the perpetual shadow of a titan requires a highly specific psychological fortitude and a willingness to embrace emasculation by public opinion. The subordinate partner must completely subjugate their ego. In the early years, Cannon played this role with clinical precision. He publicly deferred to her in every interview. He leaned heavily into the narrative of the lucky working class kid who somehow managed to secure the unreachable diva. He accepted the reality that in any room they entered, all oxygen, attention, and deference would instantly gravitate toward her while he stood slightly behind her waiting for a cue to speak. The friction of existing as a highly paid accessory inevitably begins to erode a man possessing his own ambitions. The entertainment industry is built entirely on ego visibility and the desperate need to assert dominance. As Cannon attempted to leverage his newly acquired elite status to expand his own business ventures, the glass ceiling of his marriage became glaringly apparent. No matter what television show he produced or what platform he hosted, he would always be categorized first and foremost as the husband of Mariah Carey. His individual identity was completely subsumed by her massive cultural footprint. The public and the press did not view him as a self-made mogul. They viewed him as a man operating on an allowance of fame and capital provided by a superior entity. This fundamental misalignment in power identity and public perception planted the necessary seeds for a spectacular implosion, setting the stage for a critical failure in discipline that would soon activate a strict legal mechanism designed to protect Carey's brand and assets at all costs. The illusion of a spontaneous romantic elopement often obscures the cold and calculated corporate machinery operating beneath the surface of elite Hollywood relationships. While the public consumed images of a joyous private ceremony in the Bahamas, the reality of the union between the global music icon and the television host was anchored in a brutal legal reality. Marriages at this tier function strictly as high-risk corporate mergers and acquisitions that threaten to destabilize massive financial empires if not properly regulated. For a woman possessing a net worth in the hundreds of millions of dollars entering a legal union with a man of significantly lower financial standing triggers an immediate and aggressive defensive response from her wealth management apparatus. The ensuing legal architecture established the absolute boundaries of their relationship long before any marital friction occurred. Carey did not merely possess liquid capital, she was a walking multinational corporation. Her financial portfolio included decades of record-breaking platinum albums, a globally dominant catalog of intellectual property, highly lucrative publishing rights, international touring infrastructures, and an expansive network of real estate holdings. Furthermore, she possessed an unparalleled perennial revenue stream tied to holiday music royalties that generated millions of dollars annually without requiring any active labor. This was an empire built on relentless work and survival in a vicious industry. While he generated a respectable income through television and comedy tours, he remained a high-earning employee of the entertainment machine, navigating a household funded by the woman who owned the factory. The geographical location of their primary residence, California, operates under community property laws. For a billionaire actively generating massive revenue, this state law represented an unacceptable vulnerability. The resulting prenuptial agreement was a masterpiece of corporate defense, designed to meticulously dismantle California's community property laws and isolate Carey's wealth. The legal text erected an impenetrable firewall. Every dollar generated by her music, residencies, and global tours remained strictly her sole property. Canon was stripped of any equity in her brand, legally codified not as an equal stakeholder, but as an independent economic operator sharing a residential space funded by a vastly superior force. Beyond the ruthless division of assets, the contract featured an uncompromising confidentiality clause. Any unauthorized disclosure of their private lives carried a strict penalty of $250,000 per violation. This asymmetrical gag order was designed exclusively to muzzle the younger, more impulsive husband. By legally defining him as a separate financial entity, Carey ensured that his inevitable missteps would only destroy his own standing without inflicting collateral damage on her empire. The contract was a loaded weapon placed on the table on the very first day, guaranteeing that when the subordinate partner eventually breached their strict protocols, the retaliation would be swift and legally absolute. The human ego is a highly volatile instrument, particularly when it is systematically compressed beneath the crushing weight of absolute financial and social subordination. For several years, the television host successfully executed the duties of the compliant husband, projecting the exact image of domestic bliss required by the music sovereign. He walked the designated steps behind her on international red carpets, he smiled for the curated paparazzi photographs, and he functioned flawlessly as the human shield protecting her from the isolating pressures of her immense fame. Yet the psychological friction of existing purely as an extension of a vastly superior entity inevitably leads to a desperate craving for individual agency. When a man is stripped of all leverage within the walls of his own home, he will inevitably seek a platform outside of it to reassert his dominance. This internal rebellion does not typically manifest as a calculated strategic maneuver. It usually explodes through a catastrophic failure of discipline, resulting in an act of self-sabotage so profound that it permanently detonates the meticulously constructed facade of the marriage. The mechanism of this destruction was not a secret physical affair conducted in the shadows. A clandestine betrayal, while damaging, can sometimes be managed or concealed within the highly fortified public relations machinery of the global elite. The fatal error committed by the younger husband was infinitely more destructive because it was executed voluntarily on a public broadcasting platform. He chose to weaponize his own past, thereby contaminating the pristine, untouchable brand of the billionaire he was contracted to protect. The environment that facilitated this catastrophic miscalculation was a popular morning entertaining radio program. In March 2014, the husband appeared as a guest on Power 106 for a segment on Big Boy's Neighborhood. The atmosphere of such terrestrial radio broadcasts is deliberately designed to strip away the polished veneer of celebrity. The format rewards unfiltered banter, aggressive masculine bravado, and shocking disclosures. It is an arena where celebrities trade their dignified silence for immediate viral engagement and temporary cultural relevance. For a comedian and television personality whose entire career was built on accessibility and shock value, this environment was intoxicating. It offered an immediate antidote to the stifling, highly vetted existence he endured as the prince consort to a pop deity. During the broadcast, the radio host presented a seemingly casual but highly provocative challenge. The guest was prompted to list the names of famous women he had engaged with sexually prior to his marriage. A disciplined operator functioning within the restrictive parameters of an elite marriage would have instantly recognized the trap. The standard protocol for a high net worth spouse facing such an inquiry is swift deflection, a humorous pivot, or a steadfast refusal to engage in gutter-level tabloid fodder. The husband was extensively trained in media relations and fully understood the lethal consequences of violating the unspoken rules of his household. Yet in that specific moment, bathed in the validating attention of the radio studio, the desperate need to assert his own independent masculine identity completely overpowered his survival instincts. Rather than deflecting the question, he enthusiastically leaned into the spectacle. He began to rattle off a roll call of his past sexual conquests, actively participating in a cheap locker room game broadcast to millions of listeners. The devastating blow was not the sheer number of women, but the specific identities he chose to publicize. By explicitly naming figures deeply entrenched in the reality television and tabloid ecosystems, he forcibly dragged his current marital association into the mud. He publicly connected the refined, carefully guarded legacy of a global music icon to a sprawling, messy web of low-tier celebrity hookups. It was a staggering display of arrogance and a complete misreading of his actual position within the Hollywood hierarchy. He operated under the delusion that his comedic persona provided immunity, assuming the public and his wife would dismiss the crude behavior as merely an entertaining radio performance. The miscalculation was absolute. The music sovereign had spent over 2 decades meticulously cultivating an image of supreme, untouchable glamour. Her brand relied on an almost regal detachment, inherently rejecting public feuds, cheap provocations, and the utilization of her personal dignity as radio punchlines. Her brand was built on the projection of absolute vocal supremacy and an almost regal detachment from the mundane vulgarities of the lower tiers of the entertainment industry. She had constructed a gilded fortress to keep that exact type of chaotic, low-frequency energy completely locked out of her life. By voluntarily bringing that chaos into the public sphere, her husband committed the ultimate act of treason. Transforming intimate history into a cheap radio commodity constituted a severe structural breach of the marriage contract. It demonstrated a lethal lack of respect for the protective shell that housed their family. More importantly, it signaled a complete breakdown in his utility. He had been acquired to serve as a stabilizing force and a protector of her image. By actively participating in the degradation of that image, he instantly transformed from a strategic asset into a massive, unpredictable liability. The very traits that initially made him an appealing counterweight to her intense isolation, his unedited comedic delivery, and his constant thirst for visibility, had mutated into a direct threat to her corporate entity. The reaction from the sovereign was not characterized by the explosive, dramatic confrontations that fuel reality television narratives. Billionaires do not typically engage in screaming matches that can be recorded and leveraged. Bypassing forcing the explosive confrontations that fuel reality television. Her retaliation manifested as a sudden, clinical, and terrifying withdrawal of warmth and access. The emotional access to her inner circle was simply revoked. When the subordinate partner breaches a critical boundary of this magnitude, there is no prolonged period of counseling or public attempts at reconciliation. The decision to sever the association is executed internally with the cold efficiency of a corporate board terminating a rogue executive. The trust was entirely eradicated, and in the high-stakes environment of the global elite, trust is the only currency that keeps the subordinate partner inside the perimeter. The fallout from the radio broadcast created an immediate and irreversible chilling effect on their daily existence. The husband quickly realized that he had crossed an invisible but highly lethal tripwire. His subsequent attempts to mitigate the damage through public apologies and defensive explanations only exacerbated the crisis. Every time he spoke to the press in an attempt to clarify his radio comments, he generated a new wave of headlines, further extending the lifespan of the humiliation. He was trapped in a cycle of his own making, desperately trying to utilize his media accessibility to fix a problem caused by that very same accessibility. He failed to grasp that the only acceptable response was absolute silence, but his ego and his fundamental nature as an entertainer made silence an impossible strategy. This period marked the definitive end of the symbiotic illusion. The public appearances ceased. The curated family photographs dried up. The separate wings of their massive estates transitioned from a luxury of space into rigid territorial boundaries. The husband was effectively quarantined within his own marriage, isolated from the central power source that dictated their lives. The music icon began the quiet, methodical process of emotional and logistical decoupling. She did not immediately rush to a courthouse to file public documents that would only feed the tabloid frenzy he had ignited. Instead, she fortified her inner circle, consulted with her wealth management apparatus, and prepared the ground for a systematic excision. The radio interview served as the definitive stress test for the marriage, and the younger husband failed it spectacularly. He proved that he could not suppress his own need for validation long enough to maintain the highly lucrative but demanding role he had been assigned. By choosing the fleeting applause of a radio audience over the rigorous discipline required to stand beside a global star, he engineered his own expulsion. The illusion of the perfect Hollywood family was dead shattered by a few minutes of bumbling, arrogant audio. The only remaining action was the formal legal execution of a relationship that had already been clinically terminated behind closed doors. The stage was now set for a grueling war of attrition where the discarded partner would make one final desperate attempt to exert control before being entirely erased from the empire. The transition from a privately shattered domestic arrangement to a publicly documented legal war is a highly delicate maneuver in the upper echelons of the entertainment industry. When the internal structure of a marriage collapses, the immediate battleground shifts entirely to public relations and the desperate need to control the historical narrative. In the closing months of 2014, the quarantine of the younger husband had reached its absolute limit. The music sovereign had systematically withdrawn all emotional and operational support, effectively rendering him an invisible ghost within their shared properties. The relationship was clinically dead, but the formal legal execution remained unfiled. It is in this specific purgatory of separation that the subordinate partner often makes a final, panicked, strategic decision in an attempt to salvage their public dignity. They attempt to preempt the inevitable termination by initiating the legal process themselves. In December 2014, the television host officially filed a petition for divorce in the court system. On the surface, surface, this maneuver projected strength and agency. It was designed to generate headlines suggesting that he was the one walking away, that he had grown weary of the restrictive environment, and that he was independently choosing to dissolve the union. For a man whose ego had been severely bruised by his own catastrophic radio broadcast and the subsequent freezing out by his billionaire wife, filing the paperwork first offered a temporary illusion of control. It allowed his representatives to subtly frame the narrative for the tabloids, positioning him as the proactive party who recognized the marriage was unsalvageable. It was a classic public relations smokescreen deployed by a lower-tier celebrity attempting to mask the brutal reality of being discarded by a vastly superior power. However, the initiation of the legal process instantly activated the draconian mechanisms of the prenuptial agreement they had signed years prior. The moment the divorce petition was registered, the steel trap of that corporate defense document snapped completely shut. The act of filing severed the final remaining threads of his access to her empire. The husband was instantly exposed to the freezing reality of his own independent financial footprint. The allowances, the shared operational accounts, and the vast logistical network that had insulated him from the friction of normal life evaporated overnight. He was no longer permitted on the private chartered aviation. The luxury properties funded entirely by her capital were abruptly reclassified as restricted zones. The invisible but absolute boundary lines of their wealth disparity, which had been politely ignored during the honeymoon phase of their marriage, now became heavily militarized borders enforced by elite corporate litigators. The psychological shock of this sudden downgrade in lifestyle cannot be overstated. For years he had operated under the intoxicating halo effect of his wife. He had grown accustomed to the deference, the immediate compliance of staff, and the unparalleled VIP treatment that automatically accompanies the presence of a global music deity. When that halo is violently removed, the entertainment industry ecosystem reacts with ruthless efficiency. The industry does not mourn the loss of a power couple, it immediately recalculates the value of the separated components. The television host rapidly discovered that the elite boardrooms, the exclusive social invitations, and the high-level network meetings he had previously enjoyed were not granted to him, they had been granted to her husband. Stripped of that title, he found the doors of the Hollywood elite quietly but firmly locking in his face. His jokes were no longer received with the same forced enthusiastic laughter by studio executives. The protective aura of invincibility was gone, leaving him to navigate the harsh competitive reality of mid-tier television production entirely on his own. It is within this brutal context of sudden isolation and professional contraction that one of the most bizarre and revealing paradoxes of modern celebrity divorces emerged. The television host was the individual who officially filed the divorce petition, yet as the legal machinery began to process the dissolution, he inexplicably transformed into the primary obstructionist. He initiated the process to legally separate, but when presented with the final settlement, documents designed to officially terminate the union, he vehemently refused to sign them. Months passed, and the refusal morphed into a relentless, stubborn blockade. This was not a calculated legal strategy aimed at extracting a larger financial settlement, because the ironclad prenuptial agreement had already eliminated any possibility of a massive payout. His refusal to sign was an action driven entirely by psychological desperation. As long as the divorce remained incomplete, as long as the final paperwork lacked his signature, he remained legally tethered to the billionaire. The unsigned document was the very last weapon he possessed. It was his final piece of leverage against a woman who had otherwise entirely erased him from her daily existence. Signing the papers meant officially accepting his return to a mid-tier status in the Hollywood hierarchy. It meant legally severing the only connection that still forced her elite legal team to acknowledge his existence. By refusing to finalize the divorce, he was forcing the music sovereign to remain legally bound to him, effectively holding her personal freedom hostage through bureaucratic stagnation. This tactic represents the ultimate manifestation of powerlessness disguised as defiance. The husband lacked the capital to fight her in court, and he lacked the industry influence to damage her career. Therefore, he weaponized the only thing he had left, which was the slow, grinding inefficiency of the family court system. He delayed reviews, he requested unnecessary extensions, and he utilized every available procedural loophole to drag the process out over an agonizingly long timeline. Every month that passed without a finalized divorce was a microscopic victory for a man who had lost the entire war. It was a desperate attempt to maintain a pulse in a relationship that had already been autopsied and buried by the opposing side. He was legally haunting the empire he used to reside in. The reaction from the music sovereign to this protracted stalling tactic was a masterclass in clinical corporate detachment. Evading public pleas or tearful interviews, she treated his obstructionism as a mere logistical nuisance, assigning the problem to her vast wealth management and legal apparatus. She continued to record music, execute massive Las Vegas residency contracts, and expand her global brand, while her lawyers systematically dismantled his procedural roadblocks. She insulated herself entirely from the friction of the legal battle, paying highly specialized professionals to endure the aggravation on her behalf. The contrast in their respective realities during this prolonged legal purgatory was stark and humiliating for the discarded husband. While he spent his energy attempting to sabotage the timeline of the divorce, his legal bills steadily mounted, draining his significantly smaller pool of resources. The war of attrition inherently favors the billionaire. She possessed unlimited capital to fund the litigation indefinitely, whereas he was burning through his own television salaries simply to maintain a state of bureaucratic paralysis. The media eventually caught wind of the delay, and the narrative shifted heavily against him. The initial PR smokescreen he attempted to create by filing first evaporated entirely. He was no longer viewed as the proactive man walking away from a restrictive marriage. The public and the press correctly identified him as a bitter, obstructive ex-husband desperately clinging to the coattails of a woman who was actively trying to shake him off. This phase of the separation exposed the complete collapse of his strategic vision. He had overestimated his own value, underestimated the brutal efficiency of her legal defenses, and fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power in their relationship. He was operating under the delusion that his signature held emotional weight, that by withholding it, he could somehow force her to recognize his importance. The tragic reality was that his signature was merely a logistical requirement, a final stamp needed to close a file in a corporate archive. His refusal to provide it did not make him powerful, it simply made him a temporary administrative obstacle. The longer he dragged out the process, the more he highlighted his own irrelevance, and the more he solidified his reputation as a chaotic, undisciplined entity, completely unsuited for the elite tier of the industry he had briefly occupied. As the calendar year turned, the stagnation could not hold indefinitely. The music sovereign's life was moving forward at a rapid pace, and new strategic alliances were being formed on the horizon. The tolerance for his bureaucratic sabotage was reaching its absolute endpoint. The legal apparatus that had been patiently processing his delays was preparing to shift from a defensive posture to an aggressive offensive strike. The husband had played his final card by withholding his signature, but he was about to learn that in the high-stakes arena of billionaire divorces, the legal system will eventually provide a mechanism to forcibly amputate a limb that refuses refuses to detach itself. The standoff had run its course, setting the stage for a ruthless escalation of pressure that would finally shatter his resistance and permanently sever his connection to her business empire. The bureaucratic paralysis artificially engineered by the television host could only be sustained in a vacuum. His strategy of withholding his signature from the final divorce settlement relied entirely on the assumption that the music sovereign was content to leave the legal paperwork indefinitely pending. For a time, this assumption held true as she simply ignored his obstructionism and focused on expanding her global operations. However, the dynamics of elite Hollywood power structures are never static. In the high-stakes realm of the ultra-wealthy, the status quo is routinely disrupted by the introduction of new capital and new alliances. By late 2015, the sovereign had not merely moved on emotionally, she was preparing to orchestrate a massive new corporate and romantic merger. She entered into a highly publicized relationship with the Australian billionaire businessman James Packer. The entrance of this new figure fundamentally altered the battlefield, completely obliterating the television host's fragile illusion of leverage and triggering the final aggressive phase of the legal war. The entrance of this new figure fundamentally altered the battlefield, completely obliterating the television host's fragile illusion of leverage and exposing the brutal hierarchy of wealth. Unlike television personalities grinding for network contracts, James Packer operated as a colossal industrial force, an international casino mogul commanding a net worth estimated in the billions. He represented a tier of global power that made the music icon's own massive fortune look entirely appropriate for a partnership. This was not a charity mission or a lopsided arrangement designed to elevate a subordinate. This was a merger of equals, a strategic alliance between two sovereign entities operating at the very pinnacle of global capitalism. When placed adjacent to this staggering concentration of wealth, the television host was instantly reduced to a microscopic administrative nuisance. The contrast was humiliating. The world was watching his former wife upgrade from a high-earning employee of the entertainment machine to an individual who owned the geopolitical infrastructure. The impending marriage to the Australian billionaire necessitated the clean legal slate. The music sovereign could not enter into a new, highly complex financial and legal union, while the bureaucratic ghost of her previous mistake still haunted the public record. The tolerance for the television host's procedural sabotage evaporated entirely. The mandate handed down to her elite legal team was no longer to patiently process the delays, but to execute a targeted, overwhelming offensive strike to extract the required signature by any means necessary. The legal strategy shifted from asset protection to an aggressive offensive aimed at forcing his compliance. The strategy deployed by the sovereign's attorneys was a master class in applying maximum pressure to a structurally weak opponent. They understood that the husband was funding his obstructionist tactics through his own finite television salaries, while they operated with an unlimited war chest provided by the billionaire estate. The legal team escalated the threat of aggressive litigation. They began filing motions to compel his cooperation, leveraging the family court system to penalize his frivolous delays. They systematically boxed him into a corner, making it abundantly clear that continued refusal to sign the documents would not result in a prolonged standoff, but in severe financial sanctions and public judicial reprimands. He was being legally suffocated. The message was unmistakable. The empire was moving forward, and he was going to be violently swept out of its path if he did not step aside voluntarily. The pressure cooker reached its absolute threshold in the fall of 2016. Faced with the terrifying prospect of bankrupting himself to fight a legal war, he had already lost. The television host finally capitulated. His resistance broke not because he had suddenly achieved emotional closure, but because the financial and legal reality realities of his subordination left him with no alternative. He signed the final settlement documents, officially executing the termination of the marriage. The moment his signature was applied to the paperwork, the illusion of his defiance shattered completely. He had dragged the process out for over a year, only to surrender precisely when the billionaire demanded it, proving definitively that he possessed absolutely zero actual power in the dynamic. With the paperwork finalized, the court system delivered its official verdict, laying bare the brutal financial anatomy of the divorce. The judgment was an unmitigated triumph for the legal architects who had drafted the initial prenuptial agreement. The draconian corporate defense document held up perfectly against the scrutiny of the California family court. It performed exactly as it was designed, to shielding the empire from the lethal threat of community property laws. The music sovereign walked away from the wreckage of the marriage with her massive financial portfolio entirely untouched. Her intellectual property, her royalties, her global touring revenues, and her expansive real estate holdings remained strictly segregated. The television host was legally barred from extracting a single dollar of equity from the brand he had orbited for years. Furthermore, the court delivered a crushing blow regarding spousal support. In many high-profile celebrity divorces, the vastly superior earner is ordered to pay substantial monthly alimony to maintain the standard of living the subordinate partner enjoyed during the marriage. This is often viewed as the ultimate financial humiliation for the wealthier spouse. However, the ironclad prenuptial agreement explicitly prohibited this outcome. The judge ruled that the billionaire music icon was entirely exempt from paying any spousal support to her former husband. He was granted absolutely no financial cushion to ease his transition out of the ultra-wealthy lifestyle. He was unceremoniously dropped from the private aviation manifests, and the luxury estate payrolls completely left to his own economic devices. The legal system confirmed his status as a separate independent financial entity entirely responsible for his own survival. The most humiliating aspect of the final judgment, however, centered on the financial mechanics of child support. While the billionaire wife was exempted from subsidizing her former husband, the court imposed a specific rigid financial mandate on him regarding their twin children. The judgment ordered the television host to deposit $5,000 every single month directly into a specialized trust fund established for the children. To a casual observer, this might appear as a standard child support ruling. However, within the context of their staggering wealth disparity, it was a profound legal exertion of dominance. $5,000 is an absolutely microscopic sum for a woman possessing hundreds of millions of dollars. She generated more revenue in a single hour of holiday music streaming than the required monthly payment. The mandate strictly enforced the legal principle of subordination, stripping away any illusion of financial partnership. By forcing the husband to adhere to a strict monthly payment schedule, the court placed a permanent legally binding leash on him. It was a monthly reminder codified in state law of his financial obligations and his inferior position. He was mandated to contribute a specific sum to a trust fund that would be managed and overseen by the vastly superior wealth management apparatus of his ex-wife. If he missed a payment or attempted to alter the arrangement, he would be immediately subjected to legal penalties. It was the ultimate bureaucratic indignity. He had spent years enjoying unrestricted access to her billions, and now he was legally reduced to a mid-tier debtor, dutifully sending a modest check to a billionaire's corporate accounts every 30 days. The court of public opinion, mirroring the cold logic of the legal system, delivered an equally devastating verdict. The public, heavily composed of an older demographic that remembered the classic eras of entertainment royalty, did not view the television host as a victim of a predatory system. They viewed him as an ungrateful, arrogant subordinate who had been handed a winning lottery ticket and deliberately set it on fire. The public has very little sympathy for a man who utilizes his proximity to a vastly more successful woman to elevate his own profile, only to subsequently humiliate her through undisciplined radio broadcasts and childish legal legal stalling tactics. His attempts to frame himself as a proactive, independent figure completely failed to resonate. Conversely, the music sovereign emerged from the legal war entirely vindicated. The public correctly perceived her actions not as vindictive, but as the necessary calculated maneuvers of a brilliant businesswoman protecting her hard-earned legacy. She was lauded for her ruthless efficiency. By deploying her legal team to completely dismantle his obstructionism and secure an absolute financial victory, she reinforced her image as an untouchable global icon. She had recognized a toxic, unproductive element within her organization, and she utilized the full extent of the law to surgically remove it without suffering a single scratch to her empire. The narrative was solidified. The queen had successfully repelled a nuisance from her court. The formal execution of the divorce papers marked the absolute termination of the television host's access to the highest tier of the Hollywood industrial machine. The legal battle had drained his resources, exposed his strategic incompetence, and permanently damaged his reputation among industry power brokers. He was no longer the prince consort. He was a defeated, legally bound subordinate, staring at the harsh reality of an isolated professional existence. The protective fortress of the billionaire class had sealed its doors, leaving him outside to face the elements. The structural collapse of his marriage was complete, but the true spectacle of his personal and professional unraveling, the spectacular loss of discipline that would define his eventual historical footprint, was only just beginning to accelerate. The final application of a judge's signature to a divorce decree is often perceived by the general public as an emotional milestone, a moment of closure that allows two aggrieved parties to finally heal and move forward. However, in the highest, most unforgiving echelons of the entertainment industry, the finalization of a billionaire's divorce is not an emotional event. It is a corporate eviction. When the television host finally capitulated and signed the settlement documents in the latter half of 2016, he did not merely end a marriage. He officially surrendered his security clearance to one of the most exclusive, heavily fortified financial empires on the planet. The immediate aftermath of this legal severance exposed the brutal reality of the Hollywood caste system and demonstrated with terrifying clarity what happens when a subordinate player is permanently excised from the orbit of a global sovereign. There was no transition period, no lingering friendship, and no polite commingling of social circles. The music icon executed the decoupling with the clinical, merciless efficiency of a multinational corporation liquidating an underperforming subsidiary. The moment the legal mandate was secured, the massive, invisible infrastructure that had previously insulated the television host from the friction of normal life was instantaneously deactivated. The private aviation manifests were purged of his name. His biometric access to the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estates was revoked. The elite, highly trained private security details that had shadowed his every movement for years were redeployed, leaving him entirely exposed. He was unceremoniously dropped from the luxury payrolls and thrust back into the standard operational reality of a working-class celebrity. The psychological shock of this sudden logistical downgrade is profound. For nearly a decade, the television host had been cocooned in a manufactured reality where his every whim was catered to by a massive staff funded entirely by his wife's capital. He had grown accustomed to the intoxicating illusion that the deference and VIP treatment he received were a reflection of his own inherent value. The physical eviction from her properties shattered that delusion completely. He was forced to confront the humiliating reality that he had never actually been the master of the house. He had merely been a highly accommodated guest. The luxury vehicles he drove, the Mediterranean yachts he vacationed on, and the gated fortresses he slept in were never his. Returning to his own significantly smaller financial footprint required an ego death that very few men in the public eye are equipped to handle. This physical isolation was immediately compounded by a devastating professional and social quarantine. The Hollywood ecosystem operates on a strict, unspoken hierarchy society governed entirely by power, capital, and influence. While the couple was married, industry executives, producers, and A-list peers treated the television host with the reverence designated for a member of the royal family. His association with the music deity acted as an invincible golden halo, granting him access to boardrooms and elite social gatherings that his own resume could never unlock. But the industry is ruthlessly pragmatic. The moment the divorce was finalized, the elite power brokers instantly recalculated his market value without the billionaire multiplier attached to his name. The results of that recalculation were instantaneous and brutal. The prestigious invitations quietly ceased. The high-level network meetings that were previously secured with a single phone call suddenly required grueling pitches and negotiations. The deference evaporated, replaced by the standard, transactional coldness reserved for mid-tier television personalities. The host rapidly discovered that the elite circles of Los Angeles and New York did not view him as an equal who had simply gone through a rough divorce. They viewed him as a man who had fumbled the greatest opportunity of his life. In the unforgiving eyes of the industry, he was a subordinate who had lacked the discipline to maintain his position beside a queen, rendering him both a liability and an outsider. The heavy doors of the billionaire class locked firmly behind him, and no amount of television charisma could pry them back open. While the discarded husband was plummeting back down the socioeconomic ladder, the music sovereign was executing a masterclass in upward trajectory. If the public expected the diva to retreat into seclusion to mourn the collapse of her family unit, they fundamentally misunderstood her psychological architecture. For Carey, the elimination of the husband was not a tragedy, it was the removal of an operational roadblock. Unburdened by his chaotic media presence and endless procedural stalling, she accelerated her corporate expansion with terrifying momentum. She launched massively lucrative multi-year residency contracts in Las Vegas, routinely grossing tens of millions of dollars and cementing her status as an untouchable live performance draw. She continued to expand her global branding, her perennial holiday music empire expanded its dominance, and her net worth continued its relentless upward climb. The stark contrast between their respective post-divorce realities served as the ultimate humiliation for the television host. Every time he turned on a television or drove past a billboard, he was confronted by the towering, glittering success of the woman who had effortlessly discarded him. Her absolute refusal to publicly acknowledge his absence was the most lethal weapon in her arsenal. She did not grant interviews disparaging his character, nor did she attempt to sway public opinion against him. She simply behaved as if he had never existed. By treating him with complete, absolute indifference, she communicated a devastating truth to the world. He was so structurally insignificant to her empire that his removal did not cause even a microscopic ripple in her daily operations. He had been entirely replaced by her ambition, leaving him to scream into a void that she no longer monitored. This total erasure forced the television host into a dangerous psychological corner. He had spent his entire adult life desperately seeking validation, visibility, and the affirmation of audiences. His stint as the husband of a global icon had temporarily satiated that hunger, providing him with a massive unearned spotlight. But with that spotlight permanently switched off, the withdrawal symptoms began to manifest in alarming ways. Strip an ego-driven entertainer of his elite access, remove the strict behavioral parameters imposed by a billionaire spouse, and leave him with a deeply bruised sense of masculinity, and the resulting combination is highly combustible. He was no longer bound by the draconian non-disclosure agreements regarding his daily behavior, nor was he protected by the vast public relations machinery of the Carey empire. He was a free agent operating entirely on his own severely compromised judgment. Desperation to remain relevant outside the shadow of his ex-wife became the driving force behind his professional and personal decisions. He threw himself back into the grueling grind of television hosting, hosting, anchoring reality competition shows, and producing cable comedy content. While these endeavors were financially lucrative within his own tax bracket, they completely lacked the global prestige and cultural gravity of his previous life. He was grinding for television ratings while his ex-wife was managing a legacy. The agonizing realization that his highest peak was permanently behind him and that it had been entirely reliant on the genius and capital of a woman who now ignored him began to fracture his decision-making process. The narrative of the underdog fighting his way back to the top is a staple of Hollywood mythology, but the television host operated not as an underdog, but as a banished exile who had squandered his place in the throne room due to his own indiscipline. The public watched with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound secondhand embarrassment as he attempted to reconstruct a viable public identity. He adopted increasingly eccentric wardrobes, engaged in bizarre, inflammatory rhetoric on his own broadcasting platforms, and seemed entirely unmoored from the polished, professional persona he had maintained during his marriage. The disciplined, smiling prince consort had been replaced by a chaotic, unpredictable entity desperately throwing anything at the wall to see what would generate a headline. This period of flailing professional regression was merely the precursor to the true catastrophe. The loss of his elite status and the psychological devastation of being so cleanly erased by the music sovereign had created a massive, gaping void in his identity. Unable to replace the prestige of the empire he had lost, he would soon attempt to build an empire of an entirely different, highly controversial nature. Freed from the constraints of a traditional controlled family unit, his desperate search for control, validation, and a twisted sense of legacy would soon mutate into one of the most bizarre and heavily criticized lifestyle choices in the history of modern celebrity. The stage was set for the ultimate uncontrollable descent, transforming a professional regression into a personal spectacle of unprecedented proportions. The collapse of a public figure within the Hollywood ecosystem is rarely a sudden plunge into obscurity. It is most often a prolonged, agonizing slide engineered entirely by their own hands. For the television host, the legal termination of his marriage to the billionaire music sovereign was not the bottom of the abyss, but merely the precipice. Stripped of the elite security clearance that had shielded him for nearly a decade, he was left with a massive psychological void. The entertainment industry operates exclusively on visibility, power, and legacy. Having permanently lost his position within a true Hollywood dynasty, he embarked on a desperate, deeply chaotic quest to manufacture a dynasty of his own. The resulting spectacle would not only destroy whatever remaining prestige he held, but would also construct a self-imposed financial and logistical prison from which there is no legal escape. When an ego is severely fractured by a highly public demotion, the instinct to reassert masculinity and control often manifests in extreme, highly visible ways. Unmoored from the draconian behavioral parameters previously enforced by his billionaire wife, the host's personal life mutated into an unprecedented reproductive spectacle. In a shockingly compressed time frame following his divorce, he initiated a relentless cycle of rapid, concurrent relationships. He deliberately transformed himself into a prolific patriarch, expanding his lineage to 12 children across 6 different households. To the tabloid media and casual observers, this was a bizarre, almost comical anomaly, but viewed through the clinical, analytical lens of human psychology, it was a profound manifestation of a man desperately attempting to construct an empire he could completely control. He could no longer own a stake in the intellectual property, the global tours, or the heavily fortified real estate of his former life. Consequently, he attempted to monopolize human capital, creating a sprawling network of dependents whose entire existence and financial stability were tethered exclusively to him. It was a misguided attempt to buy back the authority he lost in family court. However, biology in the modern era is inextricably linked linked to civil liability. The host fundamentally miscalculated the brutal financial mechanics of family law outside the protective bubble of ultra wealth. During his marriage, his financial missteps were absorbed by an entity worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As a divorced man, he was operating as an independent contractor in the notoriously volatile television industry, generating a finite and taxable income. By establishing 6 separate households with 6 different women, he triggered a cascading avalanche of legal and financial obligations. The family court system, entirely indifferent to his celebrity status or his philosophical views on fatherhood, systematically calculated the cost of his indiscipline. Legal analysts and wealth management experts estimated his annual child support obligations to easily exceed $3 million a year, a figure he himself later publicly admitted was likely a conservative underestimate. This is the stark, inescapable reality of his self-engineered downfall. He voluntarily strapped a massive, unyielding financial engine to his back. Every single month, a staggering percentage of his television salary is automatically diverted to fund the housing, education, healthcare, security, and daily operations of a dozen dependents spread across multiple zip codes. The freedom he supposedly gained by leaving the restrictive billionaire compound was immediately replaced by the crushing weight of civil mandates. Today, Cannon is locked in a state of mandatory labor. He grinds through endless television productions and endorsements simply to outpace the crushing reality of his child support mandates. By attempting to manufacture his own sprawling dynasty, he effectively became its permanently taxed servant. The court of public opinion, which had previously granted him the benefit of the doubt as the affable, supportive husband of a pop deity, turned entirely against him. The entertainment industry is a brutal meritocracy that demands either supreme, undeniable talent or immaculate optics. The host currently possesses neither. He has been thoroughly reduced to an industry punchline. Late-night comedians, social media commentators, and former peers openly mock his reproductive choices, utilizing his life as the ultimate cautionary joke. The prestige he once borrowed from his ex-wife has completely evaporated, replaced by a permanent public association with irresponsibility, chaos, and a desperate lack of self-control. He is no longer invited to elite boardrooms to discuss high-level corporate strategy or franchise development. His name is now primarily leveraged in tabloid discussions regarding legal custody disputes, bizarre parenting arrangements, and financial hemorrhaging. His professional identity as a capable broadcaster has been entirely eclipsed by the staggering, messy reality of his personal decisions. This tragic trajectory perfectly illustrates the core paradox of the modern entertainer navigating the lower tiers of the Hollywood industrial machine. On screen, he projects the image of the invincible, perpetually smiling television hero, a charismatic, high-energy ringmaster controlling the chaos of various broadcast stages and talent competitions. The cameras capture a man who appears to be in total command of his environment, radiating wealth and success. Yet behind the camera, the reality is a portrait of profound, inescapable exhaustion. He is a man who traded the quiet, albeit restrictive security of elite Hollywood royalty for a life of chaotic, unmanageable fragmentation. He is bound to a grueling, unforgiving work schedule, driven no longer by artistic ambition or creative evolution, but by the terrifying necessity of funding a sprawling, decentralized family structure that he deliberately set into motion. He is the architect of his own exploitation, transformed into an exhausted pawn trapped in a cycle of mandatory labor solely to satisfy the relentless monthly demands of the California family court system. The dichotomy between the two figures at the center of this narrative could not be more absolute. The music sovereign remains perfectly insulated upon her untouchable throne. She utilized her elite legal apparatus to surgically excise a chaotic, undisciplined element from her life, protecting her massive wealth, her historical legacy, and her highly curated public image with ruthless efficiency. She continues to operate at the absolute pinnacle of global capitalism, dictating the terms of her engagement with the world while her financial empire functions flawlessly. Conversely, the man who once possessed the ultimate ticket to the inner sanctum serves as the definitive, tragic lesson in the consequences of ego and indiscipline within the Hollywood caste system. He slid from the zenith of elite access into an uncontrolled, lifelong descent. He transformed himself from the privileged partner of a global legend into a permanently exhausted, financially hemorrhaged outlier, suffocating under the weight of his own disastrous choices. In his desperate attempt to prove he did not need the queen to build an empire, did he not simply build his own prison?